everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kira and today we're talking all about how to create different textures and patterns in your coloring books. The main medium we're going to be focusing on is alcohol markers. However, I am going to enlist the help of some colored pencils, acrylic markers and gel pens to really help bring these textures to life. As I'm sure we've all seen, those simple and bold coloring books have really taken the coloring community by storm. They're very popular at the moment. And while this style isn't really my preference when it comes to coloring, I will admit that some of the effects and textures these colorists are able to create on the pages are just absolutely amazing. So today I'll be showing you 10 different patterns and textures that you can use to incorporate into your simple and bold coloring pages. And then at the end, I'll share a few examples of how I use these patterns and textures in my coloring that's outside of the simple and bold coloring genre. The brand of alcohol markers that I'll be using today are from Ohuhu. They are one of my favorite brands. And if you didn't know already, I do have a cheeky 10% off discount code that you can use on the Ohuhu website for any product. However, it is only valid for another 4 months. So get in there fast to do all your Christmas shopping because that discount code is not going to be around forever. In case you're curious about the specific Ohuhu sets that I own, I have the 120 set of Ohuhu alcohol markers from the Honolulu B series, which has a chisel tip on one end and a brush tip on the other. Then the other 2 sets that I'm using in this video are actually my mum's, but we kind of have a joint custody agreement. And they are the 48 pastel set and the 36 skin tone set, both of which have a brush tip on one end and a fine tip on the other. I'm going to be demonstrating these swatches today on my Ohuhu marker pad. However, if you'd like to try the techniques from this tutorial on your own coloring paper, I've actually created a little swatch sheet PDF that you can download from my Ko-fi store. You can print this page as many times as you want and keep all the swatches in a binder to use as a handy reference when you're coloring your pages in the future. And I think that's everything I need to cover, so let's head into the patterns and textures. This first texture is a staple I see from a lot of colorists on TikTok and Instagram, and that is water. This technique is really easy and really helps enhance those water vibes, especially for coloring pages that have backgrounds with rivers, lakes, oceans, pools, you name it, anything with water. This technique is gonna come in handy. Now, for some reason, I tried using masking tape for this first swatch to see if it would create a crisp edge, but that was a total fail. I seriously have no idea what I was thinking. Of course, masking tape isn't going to stop the ink from bleeding on the page, so don't bother with it like I did. What you actually want to do is start by coloring the entire area with a light blue base. Then using a darker shade, add squiggly outlines to mimic water shadows. Once you've covered the base layer with these squiggles, go back and fill in the gaps between them. And then you're going to repeat the process all over again with a white acrylic marker. My Posca pen is definitely on its last legs, so I don't always show it on camera, but I usually do at least 2 acrylic layers just to get the opacity that I want. And obviously I went with a standard blue color palette here, but feel free to experiment with colors and have some fun. I personally love throwing in a pink ocean look in my pages every now and then. For this next texture, I was actually inspired by the Instagram account @colorwithjulia, who often uses this look in their coloring pages, especially for textures like this house that you can see here. I absolutely love this technique because you can really use it in a multitude of ways. You could use it for sand, gravel, pavement, or even kitchen countertops. It is super duper versatile. And since I couldn't really figure out a proper way to describe this texture, I'm just calling it pebbles. To start, you want to lay down a light base color and do not make the mistake I did here. I didn't let the base layer fully dry before adding the dots in the second color, and they ended up blending together a little bit. Especially if your colors are similar, Waiting for the base to dry is key. And as you can see, I've already made 2 mistakes in this video, but I do want to make sure that I always keep these little slip-ups in just to show you that everyone makes mistakes and there is always something new to learn. So trust me, I'm right there with you. And then once your base is dry, pick a few colors from the same palette and just create dots of varying sizes to give a realistic pebbly texture. I used a mix of my Posca pen and a 0.1mm ohuhu fine liner to add some tiny details, and this just helps to give the texture a little more depth. This next texture is a little more complicated and is one that always intimidates me a little bit, and that is wood. For this one, you'll only need 1 alcohol marker in your chosen wood color, as well as a few colored pencils to really bring out the grain effect. So we're going to imagine this rectangle is our panel of wood on our coloring page, and you want to start by using the chisel tip of your marker to create thick, chunky strokes across the page. This gives the wood a nice base texture. Next, add darker strokes over the base to suggest shadows as well as just wood variants. Then go in with the finer edge of the chisel tip to create a more detailed grain effect. You can then grab a dark brown pencil to enhance those grain lines, and then use a slightly lighter brown pencil to add shading underneath each grain line for depth. If you want even more definition, you can then go over the grain marks with your dark brown pencil again and smooth out any obvious pencil texture with a colorless blender pencil. Another optional final step that I like to do is actually use a black fine liner to add sharper grain lines if you want the wood grain to stand out even more prominently. Whether you go bold or keep it more subtle just depends on if you want the wood texture to be a focal point or more of a background detail on your page. Now it's time to create some tiles. This texture is perfect for floors, walls, or even tables. And for this one, you'll need 2 alcohol marker colors, one in a lighter shade and one in a slightly darker shade. So you're gonna start by creating a grid for your tiles. You can freehand it or use a ruler. I like to use a ruler for this one just so the lines are cleaner, but it really depends on the style you want for your page. Once you have your grid, fill the entire area with your lightest marker as the base layer, and after it's fully dry, go over a few random tiles with the same light marker to add a bit of dimension. Then repeat this with your darker shade to bring even more variety to your tiles. To give the tiles a more 3D beveled look, you can add small highlights in the top right corners of each tile with your acrylic marker. Next, create more subtle shadows by using your light shade to add depth to the base layer tiles, and then use your darker shade to add shadows to the rest. This layering technique really helps bring out that realistic tile effect. Similar to water, this is another technique that I've seen circulating on TikTok and Instagram quite a bit, and that is bubbles. If you know me and my coloring style, I am a massive fan of adding bubbles to my coloring pages. I just find it really fun and gives almost a magical effect to any sort of water illustration. In the simple and bold coloring genre, you most likely see the bubbles in relation to a bathtub scene, but honestly, I think you can add them to any water-themed pages to add a little bit of a whimsical flair. So the first thing you're going to do is create a circle with your colorless blender marker. Next, select 2 to 3 colors, pastel shades work best, and add a bit of each color to the edge of the colorless blender circle. Once you've done that, go over the top with the colorless blender again to blend all the colors together. And when doing this step here, I find it really helps to blend just slightly outside the circle to soften the edges of the bubbles so it doesn't look too defined. You then repeat this process as many times as you need until you're happy with the number of bubbles on your page. You do have 2 options for the layout of your bubble texture. You could fill in the entire space with bubbles so there are no gaps, or leave some open space, which I'll demonstrate here. So what you can do is color in the background using one of the colors from your bubbles, and what I've currently been experimenting with is using a circular motion for filling large spaces to avoid streaks. You just need to be somewhat strategic about which area you color first. As you'll see at the top of this swatch, there was a spot where the ink dried before I could blend it out smoothly. So if I'd colored from top to bottom without lifting the nib from the paper, it might have helped mitigate this issue. I also tried adding some dots with the colorless blender in the background to create a water-like texture, but found that these these weren't very visible once the ink dried, so you probably don't need to do this step unless your background color is more saturated. For the final step, outline and add highlights to each bubble with a white acrylic marker. And if, like me, you're extra obsessed with bubbles, feel free to add some mini bubbles and dots in the background with the acrylic marker as well. The next two swatches I'm about to show you are two different ways that you can color a plaid pattern. I love creating plaid patterns because there is literally no right or wrong way to do it. It's super relaxing to do and it's almost mindless because all you're doing is creating a bunch of lines in different colors and varying thicknesses. As usual, we're starting with a base layer using the lightest shade in your color combo. It's really important to let this layer dry completely before adding any lines on top. Otherwise, the lines might look a little blurry and won't have as much definition. A trick to know if the ink is fully dry is actually just by touching the paper, and if it still feels cool to the touch, give it a little bit more time. Once it's dry, I added diagonal lines in both directions with a darker shade, plus some lines with my white Posca and a black fine liner for some more visual interest. Personally, I often skip the ruler for plaid because in real life, fabric doesn't lie perfectly straight and flat. Freehanding the lines gives a more natural, organic look that feels true to how fabric might actually appear in reality. This second method for creating a plaid pattern uses a mix of vertical and horizontal lines instead of diagonal ones. Start by choosing 3 shades within your chosen color palette, then use the lightest shade for the base layer. Next, add some thicker vertical lines with the medium shade, and layer over these with your darkest shade to create the thinnest of vertical lines possible for extra plaid pattern fun. Once that's done, use an acrylic marker to add more lines yet again, both vertical and horizontal, to build up the pattern. For this next pattern, we're blending the first plaid pattern design that I showed you with a fun floral cherry design. And while I'll be using a mix of acrylic and alcohol markers to bring this design to life, I'll explain how you can recreate this pattern just using alcohol markers as you're watching me color. So firstly, you'll see me follow the same plaid process as before, but if you're sticking to alcohol markers, I recommend starting with the base color, then adding the cherries and flowers. Save the plaid lines for last, as this will ensure they don't interfere with the cherry details. Also, I would recommend trying maybe a light pink plaid instead of a blue. This way it won't alter the colors of the cherries and stems as much. So yeah, you definitely don't need an extensive acrylic marker collection to create effective patterns for your coloring pages. Though that being said, I do highly recommend investing in even just a white acrylic marker if possible. As you'll see in this video, it really helps elevate a lot of the textures and patterns, and those little highlights and details can really take your coloring to the next level. This next texture is yet again inspired by At Color with Julia. You can tell that I'm a massive fan of their work, and this cozy knit texture is an absolute standout for me. I did make a few adjustments to this texture to suit my coloring preferences, and this knit texture is going to be perfect for all you people in the Northern Hemisphere, as it brings a seasonal, sweater-like vibe to your pages just in time for the upcoming winter season. To start with, use a colored pencil that matches your palette to rule out some vertical lines spaced about 1 centimeter apart. These lines will act as the center point for a row of heart shapes that somewhat mimic the knit pattern. Then draw each heart shape along the vertical lines and then add some horizontal lines across to mimic the ribbing of real knit fabric. Now, I did have to cut out a bit of footage here because my camera decided to not focus, but the next step is to color over the spaces between the horizontal lines with your chosen alcohol marker color. Afterward, layer a lighter marker shade over the entire area for a more cohesive look. You could stop here, but I like to add a little more dimension. So what you can do is add shading to either side of the hearts with the same colored pencil to give a 3D effect, and then go over the hearts with another layer of the lighter marker so it blends in with the shadow color a little bit more. To finish, add highlights along the curved edges of the hearts and horizontal lines using 2 layers of the white gel pen. I know this swatch looks a little bit unusual on its own, but as you saw from Julia's finished product, it works beautifully in the context of a coloring page. We've made it to the final swatch for this video, and while this next one isn't really a texture or a pattern, I think it's still going to be super helpful for you and your coloring pages, and that is a night sky. You can definitely expand this technique to fully cover an entire sky background, but for this video, I'm more intending it to be used as a window landscape. You know, you look through the window and you see this gorgeous night sky there. So the first step is to select around 6 shades that are similar in color to create a gradient from light to dark. If you need help with blending alcohol markers, make sure you check out my previous alcohol marker tutorial. I'll link it in the eye above and in the description below. The closer in shade your markers are to each other, the smoother the gradient will be. I do wish my 3rd and 4th shades were a little closer in color, but I was just working with the alcohol markers that I had on hand. And if you also have a small alcohol marker collection and are struggling with blending, you can do what I've done here and use a colored pencil to smooth out any harsh transitions. Next, I added some fluffy cloud shapes using a white pencil. Start with the cloud opacity stronger at the top and let it softly fade out towards the bottom. And you can also add a few white dots to create a glowy star effect, and then use a colorless blender pencil to make the appearance of these details more subtle against the night sky. The final step is to outline the tops of the clouds with a white paint pen, which you can gently dab with your finger if it's looking a little bit too harsh on the page, and finish it all off by adding a few dots and stars to bring your night sky to life and just make it more magical. So there they are, all the textures and patterns in their finished swatch glory. But I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, Kira, that's great and all, but how do we actually apply this to our coloring pages? So I decided to take a few of these swatches that I've just shown you and put them to the test on this page from Year of Witches to show you how these textures and patterns can look when applied to a coloring page. Especially one that's outside of the simple and bold coloring genre, just because that's what I prefer. And this is what the page is currently looking like. It's obviously not done yet. This is all I've been able to get done so far, but I have done all the textural elements, so I'll show you what I've done. We've obviously got the night sky technique here through the windows. I'm still not fully convinced that I should have colored this in all black, but I'm hoping that once I've colored in the rest of the image, it'll look okay. It's just looking a little bit too contrasty for me at the moment. Worst comes to worst, I'm thinking I can do somewhat of a frosted glass look just to break up some of that dark blackness. And then I've obviously done the first plaid pattern on this bag here as well as this bag. And what I did to achieve this is do the texture first, and then afterwards I went over the top of it with a pencil to create the shading. And I also, after that, used a fine liner just to bring out the line work from the illustrator again, just so you can see where the creases are and they don't get lost after I've done all the Posca paint work and stuff like that. We also then have the wooden floor down here. I'm very happy with how this is looking as well. I was kind of worried about pulling off the perspective of it, but I managed to do it okay. I think it looks pretty good. I then came up with a random pattern here, which I'm honestly not that much of a fan of. I feel like it looks a bit funky, but anyway, don't look too closely and it's fine. And then obviously I also did the pebbly texture for the walls of the train. I went with a more subtle look for this one than the one I showed you in the swatch, just so it didn't detract too much from the foreground of the image. And as you can see, I did a little bit of bad coloring here. I'm hoping I can fix that with some acrylic markers later. It should be fine. I did think I could do the knit texture on their jumpers as well as, you know, some sort of pattern on the couch here. I'm not sure what you call it, the train seats. But I didn't want to overwhelm the page too much and have too many textures. Otherwise it would be a little bit messy, I think. So that's all the textural work I'm going to do at the moment. I obviously just now need to go in and do the shading for all the elements that I've based, like some hair, outfits. I may have completed this page by the time this video goes up. So yeah, definitely check out my Instagram if you want to see how the final product looks. I really had so much fun creating the swatches for this video. So if you'd like a part 2, let me know in the comments down below below, as well as what sort of patterns and textures you'd like some tutorials on. I'm even thinking I'd really like to try some of these textures and patterns out in my double-sided books, but with just coloring pencils. It'd be interesting trying to recreate it with that medium. You can keep an eye on my Instagram to see if I follow through with that idea. And yes, don't forget to grab my free swatch sheet from my Ko-fi store if you want to practice some of these patterns and textures for yourself on your own marker paper. In the meantime, happy coloring, friends. Have a good day, have a good life, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!